good morning, or good whatever time it is that you are watching this video. Today we are diving right into exploration as the second revolution that we are talking about in this unit. It's also the first one following the Renaissance. I will give a forewarning, this one does go pretty quickly. I wasn't sure how much you already knew about exploration, especially with Columbus and the Americas. So, I will do mostly the causes and effects instead of getting into a lot of the details. And as you can see here on the screen, these are the three main questions we'll be diving into: the causes for exploration, the technology that allowed that to happen and be more efficient, as well as its effect. And you can see if we look at the map of trade routes, you can see a lot of the trade routes are land-based. And if they aren't land-based, they're pretty close to the coastlines here along the Mediterranean Sea, and even going down through Africa and down around the coast of Africa over to India. And because trade was established this way, we have to take a step back and wonder, why would Europeans even want to do more exploration of the world if they had a pretty good thing going on already? And one of the causes for this was the Ottoman Empire. This started in the 1300s, but quickly grew to expand and control most of the territory that connected Europe to a lot of the ports to the Silk Road, especially there in Turkey and the Middle East. And the Ottoman Turks were a majority of Muslims, and they controlled access to those trade routes with Asia. So now, anytime Europeans wanted silk or spices or any of those other luxury goods from that part of the world, they had to go through the Turks, and this made the Ottoman Empire very wealthy. They were able to tax and make more tariffs for those goods coming through, and the Europeans said, hey, we're not a huge fan of this. We'd rather not have you be the middleman. We want to be in direct contact with Asian trade ourselves. And it's because of that that you have exploration, people trying to find other ways to get to Asia than these traditional land routes across. Another one of the reasons that comes into play as there's more travel and more places being discovered is kind of these three G's: God, gold, and glory. Explorers often brought missionaries with them with the intent to spread Christianity to the world. Gold is a pretty obvious one. People like to have gold, and especially countries like to have wealth. And glory. You can expand a country's empire when you control more land, and you get a little bit more power both in the world stage and with the trade that you can then control from having control of the land. But it takes a lot to travel, and so we need to know some of the technology that came out of the Renaissance that also helped to make travel more efficient, made it better and easier. And it's cool because all of them start with the letter C. I wish I had 7 of them so it could be the 7 C's, but I only have 5. And no, I did not count wrong. So the technology from the Renaissance were cartography, like the maps we looked at yesterday, compasses, and clocks. Compasses are important because, yes, they point north. They help orient yourself in space. But clocks are also really important because they let you know how long time has passed. And by using that, you can figure out how much time has passed, how much distance, and you can more better map and figure out where you are at if you have a reference for time. Another thing that made it easier to travel was ships. The Cog and Hulk ships were the ones originally used prior to the Renaissance. They weren't made for deep water. They were made to travel along coastlines, up rivers, and they were mostly like barges. They could carry a lot of people, but they couldn't do much else. They were heavy, and because of that, if something got them off one side, they would tip over really easily. And with the Renaissance bringing more ideas from around the world, you had new ship ideas that were brought together and kind of meshed together and changed so ships became better fit. They were more efficient. And you have these Carrack and Crevel ships here, and you can already see the differences between these two ships and these two. They have a lot more, they have many more sails. You can actually catch the wind and use that to your advantage and move them around. So you can even sail against the wind if you need to. And it's more stable. If it got hit with waves on either side, it was able to kind of rock and keep itself back in center, and they could handle those tough waters that you get when you're traveling over an open ocean like the Atlantic Ocean. They also were better at carrying cargo, so they could have more people, they could carry more, and if you can carry more, then you can travel longer distances without stopping. You can hold more fresh water and food, which allows you to take those month-long journeys down coasts and across open waters, whereas before you were very much tied to sticking near the coast for easy stops along the way to refresh any of your supplies and to make sure that you wouldn't capsize. And here we can see the first explorers of this age of discovery, this age of exploration. We have, of course, in 1492, Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was one of the first to suggest a route directly west from Europe all the way to Asia. He said that it wasn't too terrible far in doing math and that he could feasibly make it there. He had several times where he was refused that funding from Portugal and from Spain, but eventually, with the Spanish monarchs wanting to gain more power and more wealth, they agreed to invest him and fund his exploration. And he set out across the ocean, and several months later, 1492, discovered many of the islands down between North, South, Central America. He took several different expeditions, each time finding these islands, returning to them, trying to set up colonies and missions, but some of them failing. We need to keep in mind what these explorers set out to find. They set out to find Asia. They wanted to reach trade markets that were already set up. When they got to the New World, there wasn't any trade. There weren't any manufactured goods like spices or silk or gunpowder, but they had lots of access to natural resources, which would become really important later on. But because they were looking for those established places, they tried to set up trading colonies or trading settlements that weren't used to having to be self-sustaining. They weren't used to, oh, we have to actually work on the land and make our own food. We can't just wait for another ship to come through to bring us supplies, or in the case of some of the Haitian colonies, we can't rely on these raids of indigenous people nearby to sustain ourselves. But it was the explorations and findings of Christopher Columbus that helped to increase the amount of people who were interested in these lands. Later, you have John Cabot, who finds more of the North American coastline, specifically Newfoundland, funded by England. You have a lot more French and English influence that are traveling later into like the 16 and 1700s. Whereas in South America, in Central America, that's where you have a lot of Spanish and Portuguese influence. And here you have Ferdinand Magellan. He was the first to circumvent the globe in 1519, 1522. He was funded by Portugal. They were wanting to find a different sea route to Asia by going around the whole continent of South America. But cycling back a little bit in history, after Christopher Columbus discovered what they would find out were new lands, there got to be a little bit of a problem. Spain and Portugal were the two main trading powers in Europe at this time. Potentially because of their location on the edge of Europe, they had really easy access to trade routes. Portuguese merchants and ships had already established trade routes down and around Africa, into India, over into the Philippines and China, and they controlled land along those coastlines. When they discovered that there was new land, well, they had to figure out who was going to get what. And in 1494, the Pope set a line that essentially set an imaginary line across the Atlantic Ocean on who could claim control east or west of this land. The Portuguese would have anything east of the line, so they got this section here of South America that eventually becomes the country of Brazil, while the Spanish got everything west of the line. Or eventually, the Portuguese figured out that the Spaniards had gotten a lot better deal when they started mapping these areas out, when they finally circumvented and realized just how big South America was. And the line eventually moved, giving Portugal this whole area here. And because of that, the Spanish and the Portuguese are pretty much the two main influences as the Age of Exploration comes into a big play. You have conquistadors who are coming to explore land for the 3Gs, gold, God, and glory. And they start up missions. They will go in, try to find gold, wealth, natural resources eventually, coming into contact with all of the indigenous people that are there, and oftentimes causing more harm than good. The Europeans have all kinds of advantages on their side. They have guns and muskets, they have gunpowder, they have not as many people that were living in the area, but they had the advantage of steel and germs, diseases that would be brought in. And there's a really great documentary series that I can link to called Guns, Germs, and Steel. The second episode is what I would be recommending to watch because it talks specifically about the expeditions into Peru. It talks about the advantages that the Spanish had over Incan Empire, which eventually led to its decline and colonization. And it was through these initial findings of land and then the continued interest in what these lands were and what they had to offer that kept up interest and kept up these expeditions that would continually come and go and led to the Columbian Exchange. This is essentially an exchange of goods, plants, animals, and diseases across the Atlantic Ocean between what's considered the Old and the New World. The Old World being Europe, where they brought in coffee beans, citrus, sugarcane. They had they had wheat and rice, livestock, and a lot of diseases like smallpox and influenza that would become really detrimental to indigenous populations. And from the New World, you had all kinds of produce, all kinds of natural resources. A lot of the food that we consider native to Europe is not actually native at all. Potatoes, which are very connected to Ireland, were not introduced until after this point. Tomatoes, like in pizza and tomato sauce, are considered to be Italian, but tomatoes also weren't introduced until after the 1500s, after 1942. You had sweet potatoes, pumpkins, corn, pineapples, peppers, cacao, all of these things that people realized, hey, this is actually not bad and we can grow it. And it was the diseases in particular that came from the old world to the new world that allowed for a lot of the future colonization to occur. The diseases took a far greater toll on populations than actual conquistadors did. Several thousand, if not hundreds of thousands, people would be uh, affected, which made it a lot easier for a few hundred or a small band of people to come in and upset entire empires that have been established for hundreds, thousands of years prior. And all of this trade, all of this food, all of these connections was really, really beneficial to Europe.